Let 'em Go Barefoot is a podcast that dives into all things parenting and education through the lens of mindful awareness. Conversations aim to bring forward patterns, beliefs, and attitudes that shape our expectations and ideas about what it means to raise healthy children. With a blend of science, ancient wisdom, and intuition, we will explore ways to support, nurture, and connect with our growing children while also nurturing and expanding ourselves. I am grateful you are here. Hello, Jason Kantor. Thank you for agreeing to come on to the Let 'Em Go Barefoot podcast. I'm so grateful that we have an opportunity to talk about your coaching and working with homeschooled students and your past and your history and kind of how you got to this point. And I appreciate your reels too. They're very direct and informative. And I believe that people listening to this podcast will find them interesting and helpful as well, whether they're homeschooling or not. It's because you talk about how you can communicate with teens and support parents as they're supporting their kids wherever they are on their learning journey. So thank you for being here.
Of course, and I'm glad to hear that they're direct because, sometimes I'll film them and I'll feel like I'm rambling and getting nowhere. So I'm happy to hear that they're actually helpful.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I've made reels before and I've been like, how has 3 hours gone by? This is like 2 seconds worth of information. Why is it taking so long? So I get it. There's an art form to it.
Oh yeah, it's a long 90 seconds, I'll say that. And it's definitely not as easy as it looks to talk to the camera, right? It's just hard. There's a learning curve, and I have made fun of like YouTubers and stuff for years, and now that I film myself, I take it all back, and I get it.
Well, isn't that the way life is? Like the minute you start doing
Always.
whatever somebody else is doing, then it's kind of like that armchair quarterback type thing.
100%.
So if you will, just kind of walk us through how you got to where you are. I know you're in New York. You said you were in Queens. And so, let's just kind of start from the beginning, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I actually never wanted to be a teacher, or I didn't start out thinking I would do anything like this. I never even really knew what homeschooling was or anything that I do now, right? So when I was a senior in high school, I didn't think I was going to go to college. I wanted to be a professional skateboarder, actually. And I just thought I would kind of bum around the world to a certain extent because I didn't want a 9-to-5 job. And I just had no vision of what I would do when I was older. I hated it in the moment, but I'm so happy now. My mom really pushed me to go to college, and I'm so grateful that she, got me to do something because I went to college. I went away for 2 years, came home because I sort of had an existential breakdown because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was just studying general business, and I'm like, what does that mean? I'm so lost. I felt like, as most young adults do. So then I switched my career to being a doctor, actually, because I'm really, really into, physical training and just medicine and sports and stuff. So I was like, okay, maybe a doctor will work. Found out it's like, 16 years of schooling or whatever. That sounded horrible. Had another sort of existential breakdown. And then my whole life, everyone had been telling me to be a teacher. They're like, you're super empathetic. You've struggled so much in school and now you have kind of figured out how to get by, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you should try to be a teacher. And I'm like, a teacher? Who in their right mind would ever want to be a public school teacher, especially in New York City, right? But I deep down, I knew that they were right. So I got this job that I found on Craigslist of all places at it's like a half tutoring center, half private school. Some of the kids there are part of their private school program. Some of the kids just go for tutoring, but if you're a teacher there, you work with everyone. And it was teaching kids reading fundamentals. And I'm like, well, if I want to be a teacher, let me just see what it's like. And little did I know that this would be a school for kids who have dyslexia, ADHD, Down syndrome, autism, all the neurodivergency type of stuff. And it totally opened my eyes that education is amazing and I love it so much. And it was all working one-on-one. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is how I feel like education should be. One-on-one, you had your personal bonds with the students, and they would pair teachers with the students that they got along best with. And I'm like, this is the way to do it, right? A classroom of 40 just can't be it. And then I was working there. I finished up my bachelor's. I was getting my master's. And one of the kids that I started working there, was working there with, his dad had approached me. This is right when COVID hit. And he's like, hey, I want you to tutor my son. I'm not sending him to this school anymore. And I was on the fence because I'm like, I'm going to get fired if they find out. I'm like, but you know what? Whatever. It is what it is. My gut told me to go for it. And then through a weird series of events, that led me to homeschooling him full time, which I'm doing currently. He's on his, he should be graduating next June. And then just weird universal coincidences. One of my friends, when I was getting my master's degree, had a family friend who was also looking for a homeschool teacher. Happened all at the same time. It was so serendipitous. And I have not looked back since. So, sort of that experience, like homeschooling both of them and seeing that that was an opportunity, sort of just led me to continue trying to pursue it further. And here we are. So that's like the short end of it. You know, that's kind of how I
Yeah,
got
well,
here.
and I appreciate the fact that you had some time where you learned who you are and what worked and what didn't
Mm-hmm.
work. And it sounds like there was that time where you felt like you had to go to college because that's what everybody else is doing. And then you had to
Mm-hmm.
choose a degree that sounded like it might be financially lucrative or helpful at some point, but you were
Oh
miserable,
yeah.
and so you did a lot of you were trying to check a lot of the boxes that people tend to do and not really digging deep to
Mm-hmm.
figure out who they are and what they want. So the fact that you've gone through that, I'm sure gives you perspective and insight that can really motivate you and help you work with the kids that you are working with.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was a horrible student growing up. I really didn't get it together until I came back home and went to college and I transferred to a local school. Up until that point, really, I just never cared, right?
Mm,
I saw no, I didn't see myself like goals down the line, right? Like when you're just in school for business, but you don't really have like a goal in mind, like what would that look like? Was
mm-hmm.
I going to be owning a business? Was I going to be on Wall Street? Something like that. You just don't really have any drive, and it didn't make me happy. So I kind of just, you know, did whatever and did the bare minimum to get by. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, I've worked with so many dyslexics at this point. I actually think I have undiagnosed dyslexia because I share so many of the symptoms that the dyslexic kids have, and I just don't think my parents knew to get me tested. So
Mm,
I think that added to my struggles in school growing up because I was always told I was lazy and unmotivated and I couldn't do X, Y, or Z, but I always knew I was intelligent on the inside, right? And I think, it's definitely helped me help the kids I work with now because that seems to be basically the biggest issue that they struggle with is sort of like a lack of motivation, lack of drive, and kind of not knowing what the future holds and it being very scary and hard to wrap their heads around.
well, and so when you were working for the private school that also was doing the
Hmm.
tutoring, were they set up in such a way that allowed you to be really flexible with the way that you were teaching them, or did they have a curriculum that you had to follow, or were you able to kind of start personalizing things then?
Mm. Yeah, no, they were as rigid as you could possibly be.
Really?
They had a whole script and the way you were supposed to speak, and they would literally monitor you and give you like progress updates and reports and stuff based on are you following like to the T the exact words and phrasing of sentences they wanted you to use.
Wow.
And I did not listen to that
Oh,
because
that doesn't surprise
you
me.
know it's not that I'm against rules. I'm against ridiculous rules, right?
Right.
And not every kid responds to a cookie cutter script, and especially with the older kids, they pick up on that, right? You can get away with it with like a 5 or 6 year old. They don't pick up on that, and some
Mm-hmm.
do. Let me not downplay them, but when you'd work with like a 16-year-old and everyone is talking the same way, they would call us out and they'd be like, "Why does it sound so robotic? Why you have no personality?" And I quickly just realized, you can't do that, right? You can't speak to everybody the same way, and you can't just give everybody the same exact type of, instruction and delivery. their methods were amazing. They're really good at helping kids learn to read, right? And I use a lot of the stuff that they taught me to this day. But the way they go about interacting with students is just not great, in my opinion. And I think that's more than half the battle, right? You got to build rapport with
Oh,
kids.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I find that to be the case even as a parent with my children. You have to build that trust and that
Hmm.
the fact that you're on their team and you're on their side, and even when things get challenging, they need to know that you're going to be there no matter what. And I think that's the case when you're working with
Hmm.
kids as a tutor, a teacher, or some other kind of mentor. Now that you're with the one kid that you started right before the pandemic, and then you picked up a second kid, so you're currently full-time tutoring or homeschooling two kids, is that correct?
So one of them graduated in January. So I was working with him for 2 years. He graduated and he's in college now. And then the one that I work with in the mornings, I've been working with him since the eighth grade. So we did eighth grade, ninth grade. Now we're doing 10th, and he's set to graduate next June, a year early. And college is not in his future. And then aside from that, I didn't mention this before when I was kind of giving you my backstory. Also, at the private school, I met another kid there who that's a whole weird story in and of itself. But him and I had really, really good rapport. He was kind of the first kid I broke the rules with and spoke to him in a different way. And after working with him there for about 2 years, he had um, approached me also and was like, "Look, I see a psychologist and I see this what they call an executive functions coach. I'd never heard of that." And he's like, "I want you to be the next executive functions coach for me." And I'm like, yeah, I had no idea what that was, but I'm very like, I'll take it as it comes and figure it out along the way. And he gave my information to the psychologist. Her and I spoke multiple times, and I was totally not qualified for the job, but she took a chance on me because him and I's rapport was so good, and I've been working under her for like the last 6 years, alongside this whole like homeschooling and teaching journey. So like I do the one homeschool student in the morning, and then all throughout the afternoons, I have these executive function students through her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
So
that's something that's done around here too. And I used to work for a private school that was
sure.
set up for kids with learning disabilities and ADHD, and
Mhm.
um, that was part of the curriculum, was to ensure that we were helping them stay organized and think and plan and execute the plans, because it's not that
Sure.
the kids don't have the ability and the intelligence, it's that
Hmm.
the ability to do the action, it's there, it's just the
Yeah.
connection between, like, okay, now I have all this information, what am I supposed to do with it? It's fascinating,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, it
um,
is.
well, and so talk to us a little bit about your particular, you said you struggled in school or didn't
Hmm.
enjoy it. Did you notice then, as you got a little bit older, that things started to come a little bit easier for you, or was it you still needed to go to college and have those, as you said, the existential crisis to understand where you were going and what you were doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have an interesting like dichotomy with my parents. My dad, he went to art school and he became, an artist, and he had his own business for many years. And he's very, I call him like a hippie basically. He's very free spirited, type B type, personality. And my mom is super traditional. You got to go to college, you have to get a good job, so you make money, blah blah blah. So growing up, I had sort of opposing sides where my dad always pushed me to pursue my passions and the arts and stuff because that's what he loved. And then my mom was always like, that's great and all as like a hobby. But when it comes down to making money, you're not going to get lucky like your dad. And that's a whole other thing to unpack. But she's like, I just want to make sure that, you don't struggle when you get older and you're on the right path. And that's just because, both my parents grew up, poor. So she wanted to just make sure that I didn't have to experience what she experienced growing up type of thing. So I give her credit and she had great intentions, but from an early age, it just school was just not my thing, like I exhibited intelligence in other areas like arts and music and building and stuff like that. But when it came time to like a math test, I just couldn't do it, right? I'm horrible at memorizing. I get really bad test anxiety. So I was always like he's got to work harder type of kid. He's great socially and emotionally, but he just doesn't try hard enough academically. But at home, I would study hours and hours, right? My mom would force me to study, and I wanted to do well because I have an older sister. She's 2 years older than me. She's like the superstar achiever, like valedictorian. She's a lawyer, very successful academically. So my mom, she didn't realize it, but would compare the two of us. Like why can't you be like her? She studies so good and does so well in her tests. So I kind of rebelled a lot in my high school and early college days because I was just tired of trying to be put into a system that I didn't clearly fit in, and then I just kind of accepted it and bit the bullet one day, and I was like, well, this is life and I have to do this. So I got my, 9 to 5 teaching job or whatever. And I'm like, I guess this is what everyone does, right? And if you're lucky or born into wealth, you can live another life, but that's not me. So I'm doomed to a regular existence. And then I started to realize that, you know, there are way more different types of intelligence out there. And you know, as I started to learn more about education and learning, and it totally altered my perspective. So, I guess to answer your question, all the way up until I got to college, I did horrible. And then when I got to college, because it's a little bit more self-paced, right? You don't have people breathing down your neck.
Mhm.
Yeah, you have assignments to hand in and whatnot, but there's a little bit more flexibility. I felt like the room for me to breathe really helped. Where, like, for the first time in my educational life, my mom wasn't in charge of everything. She didn't have access to my grades, and you know, it was very much so self-directed. Where I knew that if I didn't do well and I didn't study, I would do poorly. It wasn't like my mom was pushing me. So I felt like I really needed that freedom to find myself, and I think it really helped. And it's so weird to think back to, like, at 17, I never read a book in my life, and now at almost 27, I read a book a month, if not more, right? And I just love reading and learning. So yeah, to answer your question, I found myself due to my independence later on.
Yeah. Well, what you just said is such a beautiful message
Hmm.
to all the parents listening who have younger children or maybe even teenagers and they feel like they're never going to pick up a book. I mean, you're a great example of somebody who struggled in the system, the way the system is set up. It's not set up to match you. And so I call that environmental mismatch.
Hmm.
And we put a lot of children in the same environment and expect them to operate the same. And we know kids are so uniquely
Hmm.
different. And another example you bring up is the comparison between your sister and you, and parents just accidentally, so many times they don't mean to, but
Yeah.
they see something and it's working for one, and so they can't understand why it's not working for another. And it's not a fault in it's not a fault in the person, it's a fault in the system that they're in or the environment that they're in.
Yeah.
And yet we only have one type of environment when it comes to school. It's set up very left brain, it's very
Yeah.
orderly, it's not really for the free flowy creative types. It's more for the ones who can follow the rules, do things in order, check the boxes, and feel very gratified in doing so.
Hmm.
For everybody else, it's like, okay, hope you can catch up, and if you can't, here's an IEP and maybe that'll work. And so it sounds to me like you were a great example of somebody who just needed a different environment, and then when you finally got that freedom and flexibility, the motivation was there. You were able to find it yourself. You needed that intrinsic motivation where everything else was coming from the outside.
Hmm.
Thank you for sharing that, because a lot of
Of
people
course.
might hear your story and realize, hey, maybe I need to back off my kid a little bit, and realize that it's not that they don't care,
Hmm.
it's that they just need their own space. So as far as working with the kids in the executive function, and are all of them homeschooled or are they a mixture?
So one of them is homeschooled, aside from the one I work with like full time. The rest are
Hmm.
in either some sort of public school or private school in New York City. So I definitely have seen, very wealthy people and very prestigious private schools in New York City. And then I've worked, with kids in some of the worst schools in New York City as well. So I definitely get a range, like socioeconomically, and it's definitely amazing. I love getting both perspectives and everything in between. So typically with just the executive functions ones, like a parent will see that their kid needs help organizing, doing all that, and then slowly it generally turns into like they need school help, and then there's some aspect of mentoring, guiding. It's never just they can't organize, right? And I'm sure you know this and you've seen this a million times over. It's never just as black and white as there's one area that needs help, right? Everything's so interconnected, and education is just this kind of beautiful interplay of like so many different aspects of our of just our life, and you can't just sort of fix one thing in a vacuum, I've noticed. So yeah, to answer your question, I keep going on these
No, no,
tangents.
you're great. It's great.
uh, uh, yeah, it's supposed to be on paper, just executive functions help, but it always ends up being so much more than that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And the fact that you're able to individualize so much and you have some freedom, you don't have the script that you have to follow. I think that that really plays into
Oh
it.
yeah.
You know, on your reels and on your page, you mentioned that there are four main areas: mind, body, soul,
Hmm.
and passions. So can you
Yeah.
explain to us kind of how you got there with
Sure.
those categories, and also just sort of what does that look like in your interaction with
Yeah.
kids? Do you sit down and say to them, "Hey, we're going to do these four areas," or does it kind of just mix and match into your plan?
Totally. So I'll give credit where credit's due. The the boy at homeschool in the mornings, his dad and I have developed a really close relationship, as you would imagine. I spend so much time with his son. Him and I are very close.
Mm-hmm.
After about actually like up until January of this year, his dad had just been like observing what we do and very supportive and doing whatever he can to support his son's educational journey. And in January or so, when I really started taking like the social media stuff seriously, he approached me and he's like, "Look, he's like, what you're doing is a holistic approach to education." And basically, he just described what I guess I didn't even realize I was doing this, but my approach to helping his son was, hitting these four areas, right? Mind is your traditional school subjects. And since his son is dyslexic, we spent a lot of time on literacy fundamentals, making sure he can do that well. And then body, you got to have a healthy body to have a healthy mind. You got to be active,
Mm-hmm.
and your body has to be worked just as much as your mind. So we value physical activity just as much. And then you have your soul, your spirit is, your confidence, your self-esteem, all that sort of stuff, where it's like dealing with emotions and just being in tune with that side. And I think
Mm-hmm.
especially for boys, it's not as talked about, right? So I definitely make sure that that's an area we work on. And then passions is kind of like what we were talking about before. Kids have to be engaged in things that they actually enjoy, right? Stuff that they set goals in and they want to work hard at, right? Things they actually love doing. It can't just be, you know, learning about chemistry or something. Like that's important to a certain extent. And I'm not a complete, basher of traditional education. I think there are definitely great benefits to it, but you need passions as well, right? You have to have kids understand that they can work at something they love and they can build it and turn it into anything, whether it's a career or just a hobby. It doesn't matter. But I think that's a big aspect missing from the traditional school is that all learning
Mm-hmm.
is just focused
Yeah.
and associated with tests and what you learn in school, and there's nothing else. So I try my best to, have these four pillars because I think that's sort of a complete person, right? We have our learning, our brain, our regular sort of studying. We have our body, right? I think we move, we exercise, we do physical activity, right? We all have our emotions, our confidence, our self-esteem, and then we all have things we love, passions and hobbies, right? So I think that kind of is what makes us complete, and I think education should touch on every single one of those. That's kind of my philosophy in a
That's
nutshell.
great. Well, and it made me think too about the fact that you loved medicine and wanted to go into medical school, because to me that's
Mm-hmm.
like bringing in that body aspect, and then
Yeah.
the passion part, which kind of sounds like your dad, where it's like go with something that lights you up and that you really enjoy doing, and could be creative. It could be, I mean, it could be something like
Mm-hmm.
hiking and and hitting all the national parks or something. I mean, anything
Totally.
that really just makes you feel excited about getting out of bed every day. But the other part of what I like about that is that it as you said, it's the full person, because in schools we disembody kids. We say
Mm-hmm.
leave all your emotions at the front door and come in here and we're going to pour all this information into your head. But we know, I
Yeah.
mean, just basic human understanding 101 is
Yeah.
if you're upset about something, or if last night your parents got in a terrible fight and your dad stormed out,
Mm-hmm.
the last thing you're going to do is walk into your math class and be like, give me some math. You don't care.
Yeah.
And so
No, you don't.
when our schools are set up in such a way that it really is about the academics, and we have to get you through these specific curricula that we've created, and
Yeah.
then forget about everything else, deal with that at the psychologist's office or at the therapist, or go see that, it's really
Yeah.
disembodied. And that's why I do think, as you found out really early on, working one-on-one with kids allows you to see them, really see them. And then it also allows you to change and structure and move things
Mm-hmm.
around and shift as needed. And then I also love that the kids called you out because they know, don't they? They really can sense when you're being genuine. And
Oh
and
yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, everyone talks about, it's impossible to scale, one-on-one education to like the massive level of public schools. And that's a whole, argument in and of itself. I think we totally could. And I think we have to try because, like you just said, we're going to have off days, you
Mhm.
know. Not everyone's family life is peachy. No one's family life is peachy. It's going to be, and you're just going to have bad days. And you're going to have periods, cycles, weeks or month where you need something different and you have to adapt. And in a class of 40 or 30, you just don't get that
Mm-mm.
opportunity. There's just one type and it doesn't fit anyone perfectly. And I think every kid should get the opportunity to have an education where, it kind of like changes and goes with them and their needs, right? And that's difficult, of course, but I don't see why it's not something we try our best to do, because it really is the way that kids unlock their biggest, unlock their potential
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Well, and it's as if all the developmental psychology and the science that we know about how brains work goes out the window.
Hmm.
It's like, nope, we're not going to use all that. It's too much. We can't establish our
Yeah.
schools this way. And it's not. It's there's plenty of teachers who would love to do it that way. I know I was one, and I was lucky enough that when I was in the classroom setting, I worked with the special needs population. So I either worked
Hmm.
with kids who were considered below grade level, who needed a little bit more assistance. So I got to pull them out of their classes and work in these small groups, and we had a blast together. And I also got to take kids who
I'm
were like a
sure.
year or two ahead in math and bring them out. So I got the benefit of
Nice.
really getting to know the kids and creating activities that were fun and engaging and that they wanted to do, because it made them feel special. They were like, hey, we get to leave
Of
school and
course.
work with you one-on-one or in a small group and play games. Of course I want to do that. And
Yeah, that
so
sounds
that
amazing.
was kind of a turning point for me while I was working in the schools. Was like, look how much better these kids are doing than when you go into the
Yeah.
classroom setting and they get lost in the shuffle. It happens. So so talk to us then about, you mentioned the male aspect earlier and with
Hmm.
boys, and are you noticing that there's an increased need for mentorship for boys, or did you notice that when you were working in the private school, or what's
Mm.
your insight there?
Yeah, I think there is an incredible need. Being in New York City, right? I'm in arguably the biggest city in the world. And the interesting thing about this private school is it was prohibitively expensive and catered to, it was so strange. You had very wealthy people who could pay to send their kids there. And then you had families that won lawsuits against the New York City Department of
Mm,
Education who then got contracts to send their kids there. I don't know the full details around that, but you got a lot of very poor inner city kids there. I'm not entirely sure how all of them came there, but I think that's how they did it. So I would see. I remember this one kid. I'll never forget him. His dad had been in and out of jail his whole life, and
mm,
he had no male mentorship. And he was the kid that everyone hated working with the most. And I loved working with him
mm-hmm.
because he was rough and aggressive and rowdy, and I knew he just needed like some tough love and someone who believed in him. And I remember on his last day, him and I, we finished our session and that was that. And he looks at me and he's just like, "So now what? Do you just leave and I never get to see you again?" And I hadn't thought about it.
Oh.
And he's like, and he turns to me. He's 13 years old, and he says, "It's just like every other, man in my life. They just come and they go." And he just left crying. And I kid you not, on my hour and a half commute home, I just could not stop crying. Also,
Oh God.
I'm like, this is horrible, right? Here's a kid, and there were so many there like that, right? I could give you 100 stories like this. So yeah, there's an immense need, and those kids don't get it because they're poor, and they obviously can't afford a service like that, even if it was, even, you know what I'm saying? Like, they
Mm-hmm.
just can't afford anything extra.
Mm-hmm.
And then, interestingly enough, since I had this dichotomy of very poor and very wealthy, the kid who introduced me to the clinical psychologist, he came from a, mom and dad home, but he had such a rough relationship with his dad that he was basically, I don't want to say fatherless, but there was such a distance between him and his dad that, he didn't speak to his parents for, years on, so
Mm.
even very wealthy people, even if you have two people at home, it could be as if you don't have anyone there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they need some guidance. And I'm not a parent yet, so I tread lightly on trying to give parenting advice, which is kind of why I don't talk about that at all, because I think you can't give parenting advice until you're a parent yourself and you've experienced it. So I would never want to tell anybody how or what to do. I can only reflect on what I observe, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible. But it seems like, some people just struggle, and I'll leave it at that. And even if you have both parents at home, kids can still grow up, you know, cutting school, skipping, doing drugs, and blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah. And I've kind of seen it all. And, I do think I work with, girls as well, a lot less than I do boys. And it's much different relationship when I work with a girl. It just tends to not be as one. I don't know what the word to use is. I just don't develop as deep of a bond.
Mm.
I've just noticed. I'm not sure why that is, but at least when I work with the guys, it's, yeah, there's just a big need for it, right? They
Mm-hmm.
just need, the young men all seem motivationless and just nervous about the future,
Right.
you know.
Right. Well, and I think too that we've lost a lot of male teachers in our
Mm-hmm.
lower grades. And if you as you go up in the schools, you tend to have more male teachers starting in middle school, and then probably the most are in upper school. But
Yeah.
I think that middle that the earlier grades having that male perspective is so important. And if kids are in schools day in and day out, not being around that male energy, I think it makes a difference. And like I said earlier, schools are set up very left brained. And
Mm-hmm.
I work. I don't know if you've heard of Cindy Gaddis, but she and I worked together and offered a couple of gatherings around the whole right brain dominant learner,
Sure.
and she's written a book about it. And that was one of the pieces that she talked about, was that when you think about the difference between a female teacher and a male teacher, why do you think a lot of people gravitate towards the male teacher? Because they tend to have that very creative, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily an orderly. I mean, it's not that they don't have order. I don't want to make it sound like they're all
Sure.
chaotic, but there's a fun
I know
element
what
to
you
it.
mean.
There's just a fun element to it. It's kind of like we're going to get down on the ground and really play and
Mm-hmm.
take things apart and look at stuff, and it doesn't have to, it can be dirty and messy. It doesn't have to be
Mm-hmm.
completely clean and orderly. And I'm not saying that female teachers don't do that too, but you know what I'm saying. Like, it's
I,
just,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
yeah. And so there is a kind of a noticeable energy difference.
Hmm.
And so that's interesting that you're noticing that as well with your
You know,
male students and female students.
one thing you said there. When I worked at Starbucks when I was in beginning in college, and I remember when I made the decision to pursue education right before I got my job at the private school. I was at Starbucks and somebody came through the drive-through, and it was a teacher, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I told them, and they're like, "Oh, so what do you want to teach?" And I was like, "High school English." And she scoffed at me. She was like, "Oh, just be like an elementary school teacher." She's like, "You'll get hired anywhere you want
Yeah.
with ease." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Go home and look it up. Look up the difference between male and female elementary school teachers."
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize there was such a disparity. And she's like, you're actually going to have a harder time finding a job as a male high school teacher, especially English, because they dominate that side. She's like, if you really want a job in any school you want, with no problem, just switch to elementary school. And I thought it was, I just never knew that. I never
Mm-hmm.
thought to even think about that. And then I thought back to my elementary school days, and I didn't have one male teacher as an
Yeah.
elementary school teacher. They were all female, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an interesting observation.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it does set up things differently, and I
Mm-hmm.
noticed, as a teacher myself, that the boys tended to get asked to leave class more frequently,
Mm-hmm.
and they were the ones that had more of the discipline problems, and then of course as time went on, and now um, now they're the ones that tend to be more medicated. And
Hmm.
so to me, that doesn't seem to indicate that there's that the boys are struggling. They are struggling, but it doesn't mean that they're broken or necessarily the ones that need to be quote unquote fixed. It's the system that they're in. So
Yeah.
we keep the whole like um, round peg in a square hole, or square peg in a round hole, or whatever, like
Yeah.
that whole idea that it was like we just have to keep throwing things at them and asking them to change instead of the environments that they're in.
Yeah.
um,
I think that's just so ridiculous, in my opinion, to
yeah,
ostracize an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old for not fitting into one specific system. It's like
yeah.
if you decided to go to try to be an astronaut and you didn't fit into that, we would say, okay, that's fine, try something else, right? But when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
school, it's like, no, you have to do this or you're considered rowdy or a failure or whatever. And it just seems like the last beacon of society that's so one size fits all, and it's just the one that needs to change the most,
Mm.
and it's upsetting to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, and you mentioned too about what you saw as far as the spectrum of people, whether they
Hmm.
were, from single parent homes or both parents at home. And
Hmm.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think it's important. It's a myth to think that if you just have this, this, and this, then everything's going to be fine. And we know that whether you
Yeah.
have money, we have both parents at home, live in a beautiful house, whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the emotional support that you need, or that you're going to get the
No.
direction and the guidance and the care that you desperately need as a human being growing up in this world. So now that you've had some years under your belt working with kids one on one, what would
Hmm.
you say that have been the biggest turning points for you when you start working with a child, and you kind of, if you see that they're struggling, like what have been kind of turning points for them in terms of
Mm.
the things that you teach them and talk to them about? Do you think it's
Yeah.
the academic side, or do you think it's that mind, body, soul part? I mean, the body, soul part, and the
Yeah.
passions.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, most of the kids I work with just feel like they haven't had someone who's believed in them. You know,
Mm-hmm,
like for
mm-hmm,
example, the kid who I talked about before, that was his biggest thing, was like, you're the first person who believed in me.
mm.
And whether or not that's true, I don't know if he had other teachers or not, but he felt like nobody believed in him, right?
I
So
was
I
about to say,
take
but he felt you did. So yeah,
exactly. So
that's
I think
huge.
that's like the biggest catalyst, right? Is it almost doesn't matter. Like, I'm not going to say, the cutting edge science and the best practices are not important, because they absolutely are. But to me, what matters most is just relationships. And if
Mm,
you have a great relationship with the kids you're working with, I mean, everything else just kind of falls into place, right? They're going to be more open to learning. They're going to be more open to your suggestions. They're just going to be more willing to do everything, right? So for me, that is like everything. Is if I don't have a good rapport, and you know I don't the kid doesn't want to work and all that stuff is not in place, just nothing else matters, right? And I just think back to all my favorite teachers growing up. I just really enjoyed them as people, right? I felt like they weren't robotic. They were human, right? They exposed me to not their personality and not their like lifestyle. I don't care what they were doing on Saturday night.
right.
I think people get caught up in that and they get confused. It's just more, they just acted and treated me like a human being also. Like I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just a test taking machine, and I wasn't just there to come in, take my test, and leave, right? They actually had some humanity to them. And I just think, yeah, that would be, to me, the most important thing, and just the turning point for everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm working with somebody and we get off on the wrong foot, until we reestablish a good relationship and a good rapport, nothing else
Oh
matters
yeah,
really.
I've sensed that. I mean, I've as a student and as a teacher,
Hmm.
I've had that exact thing where I was actually really sick when I was in the third grade, and I had to
Hmm.
stay home. And
Sure.
well, third or fourth grade. Now I'm blanking.
Uh-huh.
What year was that? I think it was fourth grade. And a tutor came to my house, and although I had been a pretty self-directed and easygoing kid in school and made good
Hmm.
grades and always did my schoolwork, for whatever reason, when we sat down to do fractions, I completely shut down. And
Hmm.
I'll never forget that
Yeah.
feeling of like, this is not working. Like I cannot get out of this mindset that I'm in. And so I know what that
Sure.
feels like as a student. And then I've also seen it on the other side with a student doing that with me. And you're right. You do
Hmm.
just have to take a break and pause and say, okay, we've got to start over or start fresh and let's do this again. And so with
Hmm.
your students, do you sit down with them? Like how long would you say, you kind of it takes for you to sort of establish this trust and this rapport and this ability to let them know that you're on their side?
Hmm. You know, I get that question a lot, and I give the same answer. It's just it really depends on the kid, right?
Mm,
So with that kid, I've been working with him for 2 years, and we really didn't develop. He was like a monster, right? He would like throw things, spit at me, hit me, like really behaviorally not good.
mhm,
And it really was only like the last 6 months that he started to finally open up and trust me, right? So here's a 13-year-old kid whose dad abandoned him, right? Trust issues like you couldn't imagine.
mhm.
I can't, like, people were like, well, why is he not learning? How come your rapport is not good with him? I don't know. Maybe he's had his whole life of trust issues, right? It's hard to
Yeah.
break that
Yeah.
in such a short amount of time. So, you know, parents generally ask me that same exact question, and I'm like, I can't tell you, right? It really depends on their level of comfortability, right? What their life experiences have been thus far. Typically the first meeting is always awkward, right? I can only think of a few that were really smooth, but I would say it takes like a good like month to 3 months sometimes to like really get into the swing of things,
Mhm.
and when you're a nervous parent, right, and you want your kid to make changes, waiting 3 months to see results, people can get impatient. And again, I could totally understand that from a parent's perspective, but if I spent 3 months forcing material on them and trying to get them to change, we're not going to get anywhere. Versus
Mm-mm.
spending 3 months I think of it as like an investment where
Right.
you're building that relationship. To me, that's going to yield much more in the long run. So typically, I'd say anywhere from like 4 weeks minimum. You know what I'm saying? It's hard to
Mhm.
gauge, but at least a couple sessions to get like those like entry level worries out of the way and sort of anxieties and whatever else.
Yeah. Well, and do you work with them multiple times a week, or does it just depend on what the parents want or need?
Yeah, depends on the parents and what they need. Typically, it's anywhere from like 1 to 3 or 4 times a week. The kid I homeschool, it's 3 hours a day,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
4 to 5 days a week. But that's a very different situation, right? That's not common. But everyone else is at least once a week. But even then, how much can you really get done in 1 hour a week?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't recommend more because I'm greedy and a money hungry monster by any stretch.
Yeah.
It's more like, no, you know, to build a relationship takes a lot of time, and it
Mm-hmm.
takes effort, and it's just not the most 1, 2, 3 easy breezy thing. So,
Yeah. Well, and I think you're teaching parents something as well. And that is that, we all have fallen prey to this idea that if you just put kids in school, they'll learn and everything will be fine. And we forget that it's not just about them regurgitating facts for a test and getting a grade. I mean,
hmm.
there is kind of a game that we play, and that is that so many of us have accepted the fact that we do all this stuff in school and we don't necessarily need it, but we realize
Oh
we need the
yeah.
piece of paper that goes along with it. And that piece of paper has value, whether we really think it has value or not. It has value to the
Hmm.
outside world. And so we all kind of participate in it, even though kind of deep down we know
Yeah.
it's a miss. And so I imagine that idea and that kind of philosophy definitely carries over to anything new that people pay
Hmm.
for or want. And so I can see how it would take a little time to sort of break parents in and get them comfortable with the fact that this takes time and effort. And as you said, you're
Yeah.
making an investment, and this is not meant to be that you're going to be there forever and ever for the child. It's more like, let's get this kid independent enough
Yeah.
and capable to utilize these skills that we're
Absolutely.
working on for for the future and down the line. So, what do you think are some things that parents could look out for if they're searching
Hmm.
for someone like you? What are some questions that you would say would be good for them to ask of a tutor or a mentor or someone who says that they actually do help kids with executive function? I mean,
Sure. Sure. I mean, in regards to executive functions, because I was just talking about this earlier today, I think if if you're looking for someone to teach that and they have one method that is good for everyone, I think that's an immediate red flag in my opinion, especially with
Mm,
executive functions, because how I organize is probably very different than how you organize, right? So
yeah.
who's better? Nobody.
Mhm.
Both of you both, like, we both go through our days and get what we need to get done. So is the way you organize better than me? No, right? It's just different. So I think on the executive functions end, if you have somebody who's like, yeah, I could help your child get organized, I have this one foolproof method, I'm like super skeptical of
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
Because I think experimentation is key, right? You have to find what works for your kid. And my mom always told me this growing up was, Baskin Robbins has 31
Yeah.
flavors, right? There's something for everyone. And she always told me that, and I just thought it was one of her silly little momisms, as she called it. But it's so true, right? There is something for everyone. And if I like strawberry, is that better than vanilla? No, it's a preference, right? And I think education can apply similar principles to that,
Mm,
where, you know, you just can't have one thing. You should have somebody who has multiple things in their arsenal, who is willing to try and experiment with many different things, right? So that would be, and I think that's true for, a tutor, an executive functions coach, right? Is you want somebody who has many different aspects, like many different techniques, and is willing and understanding that you have to experiment and there's going to be a trial and error process, and you have to just find the one that works best for the specific child. In terms of like a parent looking for someone to like mentor or guide their child, I think they have to do like more of a holistic approach also. And I'm totally biased, right? Because I think that approach is amazing. But in my opinion, you want someone who's going to help the child obviously do better in school, is going to be more prepared for just life in general, someone who's going to like push the child to exercise and get physically active, because like we said before, having a strong body is so important, right? And I guess someone who like can develop emotional regulation and like build confidence. Like I think those are just so important. When a child has confidence, they'll do anything, right? They won't be nervous to take on the world. So I would say look for someone who can help a child build confidence. That is like key. That is going to be, that's at the center of really anything, in my opinion. When they have confidence, I mean, look at like the 10-year-old kids who like skateboard and do crazy, action sports. They'll throw their body down anything because they have the confidence that they're going to
yeah.
land it, right? And we look at them and we're like, you're crazy. Man, what I would kill to be young. Yes, that's part of it. But the other part of it is like they don't think they're going to get hurt. They have this like delusional belief that they're going to be okay. And I think that just stems from an insane amount of confidence that kids tend to have. And if every kid can build that level of confidence, well, what can't they do, right?
Yeah, that's a great point too, and I like the fact that it blends so beautifully with
Mm-hmm.
what I love is self-directed education and how powerful it is.
Yeah.
Because when it comes from inside, it really is the sky's the limit. One of the principles, if you will, that I love to share with parents is
Mm-hmm.
that if there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
And when children are motivated and interested, and it's coming from within and it's coming from an area that they feel like they thrive in, that they will build confidence so much faster. And then then once they build confidence in an area, you can use that as an example when they are nervous about
Oh
trying
yeah,
something new,
that's a
you
huge
know.
thing I believe in too.
And yeah, it always using their own personal experiences for their benefit and not against them, but more like, remember how you were so afraid to play the piano,
Yep.
and then you sat down and you played the piano, and then you actually did a concert with your piano. Like
Yeah, yeah,
it really can just translate and transfer so easily for them in that way.
totally.
So how do you feel? Well, I mean, if you can share with us who has inspired you or your way of thinking about education and child development.
That's a great question. You know, I would say this might be like a cliche answer, but I love, like ancient Greek style of education, which is small groups, aside from all the weird aspects that, a lot of these old philosophers were involved with, separating that for a second, the fact that like young men would spend a lot of time with their teacher, right? And they would, a parent would send their kid with a specific philosopher or teacher so that they could teach them, kind of how to learn and all those sort of things. I was really inspired with that when I, took a philosophy class in college and we studied, like Socrates and all those people, and how it was very small group education, kind of helping the child get to the answer on their own by asking the right types of questions. Right. I really like that. And,
Yeah,
I think
the Socratic
another,
method. Do you use that?
oh,
Yeah.
yeah, big time. I think that is one of the most effective ways at helping a kid build confidence too, right? If you guide them to the answer and they're answering it on their own, I mean, what better way to make them feel,
Hmm.
you know, enabled or whatever. I'm definitely new to the, educational, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the famous teacher people, for lack of a better expression. Um,
So
so
you
I'm,
mean
I'm
like
like, I don't,
like John Taylor Gatto? I was going to ask you if you've heard of
he's,
him because he's a New
oh yeah,
Yorker.
he was the other one I was going to say. I recently discovered his work maybe like 6 months ago,
Oh
and I
wow.
and I
Okay.
resonate with most things he says. Yeah, I have a weird, I don't want to say that I've picked up everything intuitively, but you know, I've definitely not studied the greats. That's
Hmm.
the word the term I was looking for, and I've just been, over the last year, just really diving in and studying them. And I guess I just go a lot from intuition, right? I've learned a lot from the psychologist that I work under. She's amazing. And, I really just, as weird as it sounds, like I listen to the parents. I spend a lot of time talking to parents, right? Who knows their kid better than the parent, you know? So, and the answer is no one, right? The parent knows their kid the best. So I frequently talk to parents. And before I ever start working with a kid, it's just like hours of talking with parents and learning as much as I can learn about the individual child, right? So I think I'm slowly learning more about these educational greats, and I have a lot to study. So I'm catching up for lost time, I guess I should say.
Well, I mean, it sounds like that. Even though he's a very well-known person, John Taylor
Mhm.
Gatto, and somebody like John Holt, who's written a bunch of books on
Yeah.
unschooling and child-led learning, the truth of the matter is they're explaining what natural learning is, and it sounds to me like because of your
Hmm.
experiences, you got to that place on your own because of what you went through, and you had that intrinsic motivation to do better and to learn, and so you were able to utilize your own personal experiences and then replicate it for the kids that you work with. So now you're just being reinforced by reading his stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And someone had asked me that a couple months ago. So, like another teacher had reached out and was like, "Hey, where did you learn some of this stuff? Like, what books? Do you have recommendations?" And I was like,
Hmm.
"Honestly, not really. I feel like everyone kind of like you said before, everyone knows that certain
Hmm.
things are wrong, but they just don't do much about it, right? And I think you're so right. Like we intuitively know a lot more
Hmm.
than we give off, and because most people don't want to go
Right.
against the status quo, and they think, well, no one else has talked against it, so I don't want to be the pariah, and maybe my opinion is crazy and not correct. When in reality, I think a lot more people agree
Hmm.
than we think, and if we all would just spoke our mind, I think we'd actually realize that we're more on the same page than not, at least with education. We're just, we think we
Yeah.
can't make a change and we don't think it can change or whatever because it's been the same way it's been for so long.
Yeah, but it's turning.
So,
Things are changing. People are more and more
oh yeah.
waking up to the idea that they actually can and do. And I know the pandemic certainly
Hmm.
motivated a lot of people to change course. Well, so do you have any resources that you want to share, or parting words or calls to action that you would like to offer parents or anybody listening on how to support? And I guess I should be more specific on how to support their children wherever they are.
Yeah, I think that the two main things that I can, I guess, leave with is one you said before, is comparison is really not, like, whether it's to society, to peers, to a sibling. In my experience with the hundreds of kids I've
Mm,
worked with now, the two main ones are like comparison to them, either the parent themselves or their sibling, is just never a good thing, right? And then validating their feelings and emotions. I've come to realize that we often forgot and forget what it was like to be 14 and 16 and 18, right? And now that we're adults and we've been through it, we kind of forgot what it was like to be 14 and stubborn and think we have the world figured out. So I think it's definitely hard sometimes to like, I don't want to say give a 14-year-old credit or a 17-year-old credit, but you got to validate their feelings to a certain extent, because when we were 17, we thought our parents were being unfair for not hearing it from our side, and how quickly the things change once we get older. And that's something I have to remind myself often when I want to be like, you're being ridiculous. Just listen to me. I know what's best for you. They don't know that, right? And they don't have the emotional, regulation experience that we've had growing up and being an adult and getting older. And I think, remembering what it's like to be their age and just kind of validating their emotions, even if you don't agree with them, is really helpful for them. And I think it shows that you're more of their ally than not, which helps them actually take you seriously and listen to you in the future, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So it's like if they're feeling upset about something, instead of telling them not to be upset, say, well, okay, I hear you're upset.
Yeah.
I notice you're sad about this or worried about this. Let's walk it through. So instead of, or not not validating in the way of like, I'm dumb at math. Yes, you are. You're dumb at math.
Yeah.
Like not that kind of
Of
validating,
course.
but more, I hear you. I see you. I understand you're going through something, but recognizing that it's an opportunity to take a pause and to maybe back off a little bit or give them some space. So
Absolutely.
no, I definitely agree. I have a 20-year-old, almost 21, and a 16-year-old, and it's great. I mean, we've had the best time.
That's
And
amazing.
I do really owe a lot of that to the fact that I just try to level with them as much as possible. And whenever I'm getting ramped up or a little spun out, they're okay with it. Say, Mom, you're spinning out. Like, just chill out, please.
That's good. I think that
it's like, I mean, I want them to, because I don't want them walking around in eggshells with me and worried about my emotional reaction. I'm the adult. I need to have it together, right? I need to have my emotions regulated. And so, yeah, I'm glad that they can say, this is over the top. You don't need to worry about this, or you're stressing out, or stressing me out.
Yeah, that's a good relationship to have, where you guys can keep one another in check.
For sure. So thank you. And also, I forgot to ask you, do you offer virtual coaching as well, or is this all individually, like in person?
No, it's 50-50 online, in person. I love in person, and I just don't think there's any way to replicate that online. But you can also reach people you could never reach online. So I'm I'm open to both. I'd prefer in person, of course, but I'm not against online. I mean, the boy I homeschool, he lives in upstate New York, so we do online. So, I'd be a hypocrite if I said no.
Yeah.
It'd be ridiculous.
Well, so how can people find you? I mean, I know you have your Instagram page, which is at Coach Jason Kantor with a K, Kantor. Yep. And I'll, of course, make sure I include that below in the show notes. So, but are there other places where people can find you?
I'd say that's the main one. And then Twitter, which is just at the Jason Kantor. But other than that, yeah, those are the two places. I'm working on, I guess, a website now.
Good.
But
okay.
For the most part, my Instagram and my Twitter are the two places where I share most of my ideas and, interact with people the most.
All right. Well, Jason, thank you. I appreciate you being on here.
Of course.
And I'm excited about sharing this with everybody.
I'm very excited. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope by hearing Jason's story, you can see the benefit of allowing our kids the time and space to explore how they learn and what sparks their curiosity and joy. It's also a nice reminder to count all of our children's experiences as part of their learning journey, and as parents, not to get too attached to one outcome or caught up in comparison mode. What works for one may not work for another, and that is okay. If you enjoyed our conversation or found any part of it helpful, please do consider subscribing, sharing, or writing a review. It's a great way to support the podcast, and it allows others to find us. You can also subscribe to my Substack newsletter, which I'll link in the show notes. Outside of Instagram, it is a great way to stay up to date on community gatherings and workshops, as well as long-form essays on education and conscious parenting. As always, stay curious, stay connected, and stay aware. Until next time.